Australia hides a cold, unsettling truth beneath its sunshine. When the sun sets, the gates creak open and the forgotten rise. Stop breathing. Listen for the silent screams that pierce the dust. We're not talking about ghost stories. We're entering sacred, cursed ground. This is the definitive countdown of Australia's top 15 most truly haunted cemeteries. Goodna Cemetery, Queensland. The air hung thick and humid over Goodna Cemetery, Queensland, a smothering blanket of silence broken only by the distant, rattling palms. It's a place steeped in the oppressive weight of forgotten lives, where the earliest graves date back to 1864, marked by crumbling sandstone and iron railings warped by time. Visitors often describe a profound, unsettling stillness here, as if the ground itself is holding its breath, waiting. This tranquility is merely a mask, concealing the restless echoes of its past inhabitants, particularly those interned during the cemetery's years adjacent to the notorious Goodna Mental Hospital. The cemetery served as the final resting place for countless patients who died within the asylum walls. Many nameless, many unwanted, buried in unmarked plots or simple, rusted plaques that offer little solace. This historical confluence of despair and death is the genesis of Goodna's darkest legends. The energy, say local investigators, is concentrated near the old pauper sections, an area imbued with the anguish of the institutionalized, their minds broken in life and their spirits trapped in death. Specific sightings frequently involve shadow figures, darting among the older monuments at dusk, described as thin, hunched shapes moving with unnatural speed. However, the most disturbing phenomenon is auditory. Witnesses report hearing faint, melancholic humming or distant, nonverbal cries emanating from the thickets that surround the perimeter. These sounds are often localized by professional equipment but vanish upon approach, suggesting residual recordings of long-dead suffering. One recurring report involves a woman's muffled weeping heard near a broken angel statue, a sorrow so palpable it feels like a physical punch to the chest. To walk among the cracked slabs of Goodna after dark is to trespass on the territory of the eternally disturbed. It is a place that reminds you that some suffering doesn't end with death. It merely settles into the soil, waiting for the humidity to rise and the veil between worlds to thin. When you leave, the silence follows, clinging to your clothes and whispering that those who died without peace rarely allow the living to find it. 2. Rookwood Cemetery, New South Wales. The night air above Rookwood Cemetery, the largest and oldest necropolis in the southern hemisphere, is thick and cold, tasting of damp sandstone and forgotten funerals. It is a labyrinth of monumental grief, where silence is perpetually broken only by the rustling of mature oaks and the distant hum of the Strathfield railway line. But within the Victorian-era Anglican sections, particularly near the crumbling vaults of the early settler families, a deeper, more unsettling silence reigns, heavy with the weight of hundreds of thousands of buried lives. Local lore and the persistent whispers of cemetery groundskeepers focus intensely on the plight of the forgotten children. In the early 20th century, Rookwood was the site of mass graves for infants and young children who died from infectious diseases or poverty. Often interred without proper markers, the residual energy of this collective, unacknowledged sorrow manifests as distinct auditory phenomena. Visitors and security patrols report hearing faint, persistent crying, not the sharp, sudden wail of an adult's terror, but the low, mournful whimpering of a distressed child, often seemingly emanating from the very earth beneath their feet. The chilling conclusion of many documented encounters occurs specifically around midnight near the old mortuary station, now decommissioned, but once the terminus for funeral trains arriving from Sydney. A recurring apparition, described as a translucent young woman dressed in period white mourning attire, is seen pacing the dilapidated platform. She is believed to be Eliza, a mother who lost 3 children in the 1919 influenza pandemic and was unable to afford their individual burial plots. She never speaks, but her presence generates an extreme localized temperature drop, plunging the air into instant, bone-aching coldness, a sensory confirmation of the profound, endless sorrow that holds her captive. To look into her vacant eyes is to glimpse the crushing reality of Rookwood, a place where the dead do not necessarily rest, but remain tethered to the grief that defined their final, unquiet moments. As dawn approaches, she slowly fades, leaving behind only the unbearable cold and the lingering, metallic scent of ozone, a spectral residue of a heartbreak that time cannot bury. Three, Waverley Cemetery, New South Wales. The salt-laced wind off the Pacific perpetually scours the marble angels of Waverley Cemetery, eroding both the stone and the boundary between worlds. Perched dramatically on the high cliffs overlooking Bronte Beach, this vast Victorian necropolis is famed less for its architecture than for the unsettling persistence of its residents. The cemetery's unique placement of final, exposed resting place for thousands who died in early Sydney ensures that the atmosphere is heavy with the sea's sorrow. When the fog rolls in from the Tasman Sea, visibility drops, but the ambient sense of observation intensifies, prompting countless calls to local police concerning movement among the silent monuments. Its history is saturated with tragedy, shipwreck victims, soldiers, and victims of early Sydney plagues, all laid to rest facing the unforgiving ocean. The most consistent and distressing legend concerns the widow of the cliffs. She is rumored to be the distraught spirit of a woman who, in the early 1900s, leaped to her death from the precipice after her husband, a merchant sailor, was lost in a storm. Security staff confirm she is not seen near any known grave plot, but exclusively along the perimeter pathways near the edge of the drop. Maintaining her hopeless vigil, night shift security logs frequently confirm persistent anomalies. Late-night patrols routinely report inexplicable, localized drops in temperature, often accompanied by the sound of faint, ragged weeping that seems to travel on the gusting wind, but ceases abruptly the moment a torchlight illuminates the area. Furthermore, researchers studying the cemetery's history of drowning victims have documented auditory phenomena that sound like distant, frantic splashing coming from the direction of the water. Even on calm nights, visitors who linger too long after sunset occasionally claim to see a fleeting white shape described consistently as a translucent veil or shroud drifting rapidly between the columns of the central mausoleums. The relentless coastal environment acts as both the cemetery's messenger and its anchor, carrying the sounds of the departed, ensuring they never fully settle. To walk Waverley at dusk is to understand that the dead here are not resting. They are merely waiting for the tide to bring back what they lost, or perhaps for a living companion to join their endless watch upon the cold precipice. 4. Ballarat Old Cemetery, Victoria. The Ballarat Old Cemetery, established during the frenetic height of the Victorian gold rush, sits under a pall of perpetual gloom. The wrought iron fences are rusted teeth against the biting wind, and the granite headstones, listing and worn, testify to lives cut short by disease, mining accidents, or simple desperation. Even on clear days, a specific oppressive silence settles over the older sections, a silence that seems to absorb all natural sound, leaving only the faint, abrasive whisper of unsettled soil moving beneath the dry grass. The historical record confirms that mortality rates were catastrophic between 1850 and 1870. Hundreds died without kin or funds, buried hastily in unmarked trenches near the western wall, often victims of typhoid or the treacherous collapse of deep shafts. This neglect has fed the primary local legend, that the truly restless dead of Ballarat are not the wealthy pioneers resting in vaults, but the forgotten, the impoverished diggers who succumb to starvation just steps from unimaginable wealth. Their collective frustration is said to manifest as a deep, structural coldness that modern thermal cameras cannot explain or mitigate. Researchers conducting sound mapping in the 1990s captured multiple instances of EVP electronic voice phenomena attributed to the site. The most disturbing recurring sound is a low, frantic scratching, often recorded near plots containing children who died in the 1861 diphtheria outbreak, sometimes accompanied by faint, muffled coughing. Security patrols have also logged repeated sightings of a solitary, gray figure, a man in heavily stained period clothing, observed weeping silently near the area designated for the unmarked graves. When approached, the figure does not flee or acknowledge the observer. It simply ceases to be, as if the light absorption required for its visual manifestation had failed instantaneously. The Ballarat Old Cemetery is not merely a repository of history. It is an active monument to suffering. Those who remain too long after twilight report an overwhelming sense of being monitored from below, a suffocating pressure that has nothing to do with air or gravity. The ground itself here feels unstable, weighted down not by stone, but by the relentless, cold grief of thousands of forgotten souls who still demand recognition in the dead hours of the night. Castlemaine Cemetery, Victoria. The air in Castlemaine, Victoria, holds a residual chill that goes deeper than the Central Highlands winter. It settles most heavily over the massive, sprawling grounds of the Castlemaine Cemetery, a silent monument to the explosive boom and subsequent despair of the Gold Rush era. The Victorian ironwork gates are permanently rusted open, inviting entry into a maze of tilting granite and broken marble angels. At twilight, the site feels less like a resting place and more like a reservoir of concentrated, lingering grief, amplified by the oppressive density of the centuries-old cypress trees that line the main avenue. Established in 1853, the cemetery quickly filled with casualties of both fever and fortune. The sheer volume of sudden deaths, mining accidents, typhoid epidemics, and desperate suicides sank into the very soil. Local lore speaks of a specific, crowded section, often called the Pauper's Patch. It's where the graves are unmarked or simply denoted by sandstone shards. It is widely believed that the most restless spirits here are not those of respected citizens, but forgotten, angry miners whose dreams died violently on the unforgiving fields of Mount Alexander and who never found rest or recognition. Accounts of spectral activity are consistent and specific. Visitors and cemetery staff frequently report the sound of heavy, dragging chains emanating from the rear paths, sometimes accompanied by faint, desperate coughing. Fits a sound often attributed to victims of advanced miner's lung, seeking release. Most disturbing, however, is the apparition known as the Grey Lady. She is sighted near the monumental tomb of a prominent local official. Her form indistinct, but her presence always accompanied by a rapid and inexplicable drop in ambient temperature. Witnesses claim she is eternally searching for a lost child, rumored to have been buried quickly and incorrectly during the peak of the epidemic panic, condemned to search forever among the crowded plots. The Castlemaine Cemetery remains operational, yet its history ensures a pervasive atmosphere of profound unease. Investigators often note an intense feeling of being watched, especially when walking the longer avenues after sunset. The spirits here are not actively malicious, perhaps, but perpetually unfinished. They are stark, enduring echoes of a chaotic, brutal history, trapped eternally in the dusty silence between the granite monuments, waiting for a peace that the tumultuous Gold Rush era never afforded them. 6. Fremantle Cemetery, Western Australia. The ocean wind, salt-laced and mournful, always carried the sounds of the dead across Fremantle Cemetery. Here, the sand dunes meet the limestone cliffs, and the dense labyrinth of Victorian monuments and pioneer headstones stretches out under the indifferent gaze of the Southern Cross. It is a place of inescapable gravity, heavy with the stories of convicts, settlers, and those lost to the unforgiving sea. But the true weight rests in the shadow of the Gothic mortuary chapel, where the ground is notoriously disturbed. Local historians speak in hushed tones of the cemetery's most tragic figure, Martha, a young woman buried in an unmarked plot near the northern wall in the late 1890s. The victim of a brutal, unresolved crime, her restless spirit is said to be forever searching for the identity of her killer. Trapped in the final moments of her terror, her legend intertwines darkly with the infrastructure itself. For decades, maintenance workers have reported inexplicable cold spots and the scent of lilies, Martha's favorite flower, near the old sexton's cottage. Even in the hottest summer months, the truly chilling encounters, however, occur around the central path after dusk. Visitors who linger past the official closing time describe the distinct sound of dragged footsteps scraping along the granite pathways, followed by the faint, high-pitched weeping of a woman nearby, though no living soul can be found. Occasionally, the weeping ceases abruptly, replaced by the terrifying sound of frantic scratching against the internal surface of the oldest stone crypts, as if someone is desperately trying to claw their way out. To stand at the gate as the last light fades is to feel the air thicken with ancient despair. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the sound of the nearby waves is muffled, witnesses have sworn to see a translucent, shimmering outline, a shadow that does not belong to the lampposts standing utterly still on the eastern slope. Eternally waiting, its chilling stillness confirming that the secrets of Fremantle are not buried, merely contained. Seven. St. Patrick's Cemetery, North Parramatta, New South Wales. The humid breath of the Parramatta night settled heavily over St. Patrick's Cemetery, muffling the distant suburban traffic. Established in 1824, this ground holds the dense, complicated history of early colonial Sydney, a silent, sprawling ledger of pioneers, impoverished settlers, and overlooked convicts. The headstones lean, eroded by 2 centuries of river moisture and neglect, creating an oppressive labyrinth where the boundaries between memory and immediate presence blur. Locals know the profound chill is not merely a draft. It is the deep cold of unresolved history, clinging tenaciously to the heavy red clay. The most persistent accounts concern the Stone Garden, the oldest walled section near the eastern boundary. Witnesses consistently describe encountering a fleeting figure, often identified as a woman clad in pale, antiquated linen, moving with profound grief between the crumbling sandstone monuments. She appears not as an aggressor, but as an eternally sorrowful sentinel, perpetually searching for a grave marker that may have been lost entirely to time. Researchers monitoring the site have documented inexplicable electromagnetic spikes and sudden, dramatic temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Specifically, when passing the unmarked plots said to belong to the paupers of the 1830s. Beyond the visual sightings, St. Patrick's is notorious for auditory phenomena. Visitors who linger past midnight often report the thin, heart-rending sound of infant crying originating from the sections reserved for children and stillbirths, a residual echo of the devastating colonial mortality rates. These sounds are not projections. Specialized field recordings have captured acoustic anomalies consistent with distress calls, yet originating from areas demonstrably devoid of living occupants. The air itself becomes weighted, saturated with palpable, ancient despair. To enter St. Patrick's after dark is to step into a static pocket of time where past suffering remains energetically vibrant. The site does not merely retain memories, it actively manifests them. Those who have attempted overnight vigil report a crushing sense of profound intrusion, the unmistakable knowledge that they are being scrutinized not by a single spirit, but by hundreds of unseen eyes, bound by the North Parramatta earth, and angered by the trespass of the living into their enduring heavy silence. Old Sydney Burial Ground, New South Wales. The constant thrum of George Street traffic struggles to mask the silence beneath the paving stones. Beneath the polished marble and the grand Victorian edifice of the Sydney Town Hall lies the colony's oldest scar, the Old Sydney Burial Ground, operational from 1792 until 1820. This small initial cemetery was the final resting place for perhaps 2,000 early colonists, convicts, and military personnel. It was a dense, miserable plot where the rough realities of colonial death were compressed into a confined space before the city swallowed it whole. When the burgeoning metropolis demanded expansion, the decision was made in the 1870s to formally exhume the remains and relocate them to Rookwood. However, the move was haphazard, poorly funded, and deeply disrespectful. Countless bodies, particularly those in unmarked or deteriorating wooden coffins, were left behind, sealed beneath the town hall foundations and the adjacent St. Andrew's Cathedral. This immense, intentional disrespect created a spiritual density that the modern structures have failed to contain. Trapping the confusion and resentment of the forgotten dead, the resulting phenomena manifest most acutely in the town hall's basement levels and near the subterranean tunnels that snake beneath the busy intersection. Maintenance staff routinely report extreme temperature drops and the oppressive smell of mildewed cloth and earth, often accompanied by the faint, rhythmic sound of chains, a tragic echo of the convict eras interred. More distinct are the sightings attributed to John Golder, the graveyard's overseer, whose gaunt, disapproving figure is sometimes spotted near the old foundations. He is said to patrol the deeper levels, furious that his assigned sacred ground is now merely a glorified cellar. The disturbance of so many forgotten dead means the haunting is not tied to a single tragedy, but is rather a communal spectral complaint directed at the entire structure. Every time the heavy bronze doors of the Sydney Town Hall swing shut, the sound traps the silent, perpetual resentment of the 18th century souls who still lie undisturbed, not in consecrated earth, but deep beneath the asphalt in the city's indifferent civic pride. Camperdown Cemetery, New South Wales. Camperdown Cemetery stands as an island of shadow, a Gothic anachronism marooned within the ceaseless surge of inner-city Sydney. Here, amidst the tightly packed gravestones, many tilting precariously or choked by invasive fig roots, the air itself feels heavier, charged with the residual melancholy of 2 centuries. The high sandstone walls, originally intended to contain the dead, now seem only to amplify the silence, filtering the streetlights into weak, sickly moons across the elaborate, decaying monuments to colonial tragedy and forgotten glory. It is a place where history is not merely recorded on stone, but felt on the skin, a lingering coldness that defies the climate. Established in 1848, the grounds were swiftly filled, serving as a primary burial site for early Sydney inhabitants, including victims of widespread epidemics and devastating childhood mortality. The sheer saturation of remains, estimated at over 15,000 interments, is rumored to contribute to the cemetery's restless energy, fueling tales of phenomena documented by both local historians and paranormal investigators. Chief among these persistent legends is the ghost of Eliza Donnithorne, A young girl whose elaborate effigy, now faded and worn, marks her grave. Visitors report hearing the distinct sound of a child weeping near her plot. Though no living source is ever found within the locked perimeter, the atmosphere shifts sharply after midnight, particularly near the dilapidated crypts bordering the cemetery's northern edge. Documentation exists detailing drastic temperature drops and sudden, localized fields of oppressive cold, often accompanied by the sensation of being nudged or actively pushed by an unseen force. Furthermore, a phenomenon described consistently since the 1970s involves a faint, anachronistic procession. Witnesses claim to hear the muffled tolling of a bell and the scrape of iron wheels on gravel, the soundscape of a funeral cortege winding through the lanes, a spectral echo of the thousands of silent journeys made to this final resting place. Camperdown is not merely a memorial, it is a repository of unreleased anguish. The overwhelming sense of intrusion felt by those who linger late suggests that the density of the dead has allowed them to bleed into the present. They manifest not through grand theatrics, but through subtle, undeniable pressures. The quick chill on the back of the neck, the sound of weeping when the rain has stopped, and the certain knowledge that in this tightly packed earth, very few souls rest in peace. Then, Toowong Cemetery, Queensland. The sheer scale of Toowong Cemetery, established in 1875, lends it an oppressive, enduring presence. Queensland's largest necropolis is not merely a resting place, it is a sprawling, manicured map of the region's history, shadowed by immense Corey pines and the dense, humid air of Brisbane. When the sun drops behind Mount Coot-tha, the monumental stone architecture, the weeping angels, the obelisks, and the tightly packed rows of marble seem to absorb all ambient sound, leaving visitors isolated in a realm governed by silence and profound antiquity. This massive site holds over 120,000 souls, including figures instrumental to the colony's formation, alongside victims of historical pandemics and forgotten tragedies. Among the prominent residents is Boyd Dunlop Moorhead, a former premier whose massive tomb near the highest ridge is a consistent epicenter for documented spectral resonance. Legends persist of a heavy, corporeal shadow that manifests in the fading light, moving with purposeful agitation, often mistaken by late security patrols for an intruder, only to vanish when challenged directly. Paranormal investigators frequently cite Toowong as a location rich in residual hauntings, particularly auditory phenomena near the main gates. After the midnight hour, witnesses have consistently reported the distinct clatter of carriage wheels and the muffled, frantic whinnying of horses, an echo from the Victorian era that abruptly cuts out mid-sound. More disturbingly, around the 1919 Spanish flu victims section, temperature fluctuations drop precipitously, often accompanied by the faint, chilling aroma of ozone and the sound of shallow, labored breathing picked up on sensitive recording equipment, suggestive of a collective, lingering death anxiety. To walk Toowong at night is to navigate a landscape where the deceased hold undisputed dominion. Every cold spot, every inexplicable whisper carried on the humid breeze, reinforces the understanding that these historical figures refuse to surrender their foothold in the living world. The cemetery does not merely contain the dead, it actively retains them, their silent, observational presence ensuring that the visitor leaves, burdened by the knowledge of history's unrelenting gaze. Shri, Nunda Cemetery, Queensland. The air above Nunda Cemetery always hangs heavy and damp, smelling faintly of river silt and ancient, disturbed earth. Established in 1846, it is Brisbane's oldest, a sprawling labyrinth of crumbling sandstone and tilting crosses that feel less like a resting place and more like an unfinished, anxious city. Local legends whisper that when the nearby German station was settled, the boundary lines of the cemetery were laid carelessly, inadvertently trapping and disturbing the sacred ground of the Yagara and Turrbal people. This foundational disrespect, they say, is why the ground here never truly settled. The most persistent, chilling account concerns the phantom funeral procession. Multiple witnesses, from night shift Brisbane City Council workers to late-night dog walkers, report seeing a column of figures entering the original North Gate shortly after midnight. They appear cloaked in dense, gray Victorian mourning attire, their faces indistinct, shimmering like heat haze over asphalt. There is no sound of footsteps, only a profound, sudden drop in ambient noise, an oppressive silence that swallows the chirping of crickets and the distant drone of traffic. The procession proceeds slowly, deliberately, until it reaches the highest point of the old Protestant section, where they simply vanish into thin air, leaving only the sound of normal life rushing back in, jarring and overwhelming. Yet, the truly terrifying encounters involve the cemetery's restless children. Among the worn headstones of the paupers section, where simple wooden markers rotted away decades ago, visitors often report the sound of soft, rapid footsteps circling their position. The most notorious spirit is that of a young girl, sometimes seen playing near the Central Avenue's iron fence. She is never crying or distraught, rather, she is intensely focused on her game, a silent, unsettling concentration. If anyone approaches, she stops, turns her head slowly, and gives a broad, unsettling grin, a wide, unsettling expression that stretches too far across her face before she melts back into the shadow of the nearest mausoleum. She is not trapped, the locals believe, but watching, her silent game continues, played out over the unmarked graves, waiting for the unwary to join the spectral procession that endlessly seeks a final, quiet resting place in the perpetually restless soil of Nunda. Sure. Ipswich General Cemetery, Queensland. The Ipswich General Cemetery, established in 1864, sits heavy beneath the subtropical Queensland sky. Its Victorian monuments stain the color of old tea. A pervasive, heavy silence settles between the lichen-dusted angels and the crumbling sandstone obelisks. It is a place defined not merely by the dead, but by the relentless weight of time and the profound chill that resists the midday heat. Locals avoid the lower sections, where the early, unmarked graves blend into the dense undergrowth, believing the soil here holds a denser, more agitated sorrow than the rest of the grounds. A chilling weight of unresolved history, the grounds were a necessity born of colonial hardship, an interment site for gold rush casualties, typhoid victims, and those lost to the harsh realities of early Ipswich industry. Among the thousands interred, one tragic narrative persists with unnerving clarity. The legend of a young girl named Eliza, tragically killed in a cart accident on the Boundary Road in 1878. Her small, weathered marker near the eastern wall is often noted for its unnaturally low temperature, regardless of the season. Historical records indicate a devastatingly high incidence of stillbirths and infant mortality in the 1880s, lending a potent collective grief to the area historically known as the Baby's Plot. From a section where no flowers seem to take root, paranormal investigations conducted over the last 2 decades consistently record anomalous spikes in electromagnetic fields near the old Sexton's Cottage Foundation. The phenomena are frequently auditory, muffled crying that seems to originate from the ground itself, and the distinct sound of a child's leather boots crunching on gravel. Despite no one being present, the most tangible sightings involve a pale, translucent figure often described as wearing a simple muslin dress who drifts between the rows of older Celtic crosses. Perpetually searching, witnesses report that if this figure is seen, the ambient air temperature can plummet by 15 degrees in seconds, a sudden, shocking cold that feels less like weather and more like a profound spiritual intrusion. The Ipswich Cemetery is a catalog of forgotten lives, where the boundaries between memory and manifestation are dangerously thin. To walk its pathways after dusk is to trespass on a quiet, enduring anguish, a cold documentation of Queensland's past that remains actively unwilling to rest within the confines of its soil. Shirsan, Karrakatta Cemetery, Western Australia. The wrought iron gates of Karrakatta Cemetery, resting under a perpetual blanket of Fremantle doctor's chill, do not just mark a boundary between the living and the dead. They seal an archive of sorrow spanning over a century. By day, the place is a study in Victorian stonework and native gums. But as the heat bleeds from the concrete paths after dusk, a profound quiet descends, punctuated only by the rustle of leaves that seem to whisper names long forgotten. Security patrols often report the deep, unnerving sensation of being explicitly observed from the dense cluster of mausoleums near the old Anglican section, a feeling less of intrusion and more of assessment. The cemetery, consecrated in 1899, became the final resting place for many of Western Australia's early pioneers, including victims of mining disasters, forgotten soldiers, and the unfortunate inhabitants of the old lunatic asylum. Local legend holds that Karrakatta is home to a specific, deeply malevolent entity, the Lady in Black. She is not a benevolent mourner. Historical accounts suggest she was a woman wronged, perhaps a widow who died of grief or despair. Tethered fiercely to the grounds, her activity is rarely visual, preferring instead to manifest through severe thermal drops and highly focused psychokinetic energy aimed at those who linger after the mandatory closing time. Experienced night watchmen tell of their flashlights failing consistently around the grave of former Governor Sir Frederick Broome, and the distinctive sound of silk dragging across granite in the older plots always near, but never locatable. One documented incident involves a patrol car's radio suddenly broadcasting unintelligible, distorted Victorian-era music before the vehicle's interior temperature plummeted, leaving the occupant with visible frost tracing the inside of the windshield glass. Despite the mild Perth night, this cold is reported to be an agonizing, bone-deep chill that lingers long after the encounter. To walk Karrakatta after midnight is to accept an invitation into a suffocating, hostile silence. It is a place where the air itself feels heavy with untold tragedies, and where the presence of the Lady in Black ensures that the dead are never truly alone, nor are the living who dare disturb their slumber. The final, chilling realization is that the gates are merely symbolic. Once you are inside her domain, there is no guarantee of an easy exit. Melrose Cemetery, South Australia. The air above the graves at Melrose is perpetually thin and dry, carrying the scent of saltbush and ancient granite, set against the vast, looming silence of the southern Flinders Ranges. Melrose Cemetery is less a resting place and more an open-air museum of hardship. The original plots, dating back to the 1850s, feature rough-hewn slate stones that barely resist the wind erosion, marking lives brutally cut short by mining accidents, typhoid, and the relentless heat. This isolation breeds a profound, palpable sense of unrest that clings to the exposed earth after the sun drops. Local lore consistently points to the grave of Elias Thorne, a shepherd interred in 1867 who was reportedly driven mad by loneliness and exposure while guarding distant flocks. Though official records cite natural causes, the true story is woven with tales of misdirection and intentional wandering, suggesting Thorne deliberately lost himself in the endless scrub. It is said Thorne's spirit remains fundamentally confused and profoundly lost, forever attempting to navigate back to a home that never existed in the merciless landscape. His presence is characterized not by malice, but by an absolute, directional confusion. The most frequent disturbances reported by passing campers and maintenance crews are auditory. Witnesses describe hearing faint, rhythmic tapping sounds emanating from the older sections after dusk, reminiscent of a lantern being struck repeatedly against rock. More disturbing are the visual reports. A recurring, indistinct figure that appears briefly on the northern boundary fence line, moving with a staggering, uneven gait, but casting no discernible shadow under the full moon. Researchers employing sensitive thermal imaging have documented acute, localized drops in temperature centered near Thorne's grave, plummeting sometimes 15 degrees below the ambient ground reading, only to vanish instantly. The unsettling truth about Melrose is not the fear of being actively chased, but the deeper terror of witnessing unending, frustrated grief. Elias Thorne is not haunting the living. He is simply continuing his patrol, eternally cold, forever searching for a clear path that time and death have erased entirely, confirming that the most terrifying spirits are those who do not yet know they have been released. Springvale Botanical Cemetery, Victoria. The air over Springvale is uniquely heavy, even in the cool Victorian twilight. This is not merely a garden of rest, it is an immense, sprawling metropolis of the dead, its meticulously kept lawns concealing a staggering density of final resting places. When the last mourner's car departs, a profound silence settles, broken only by the rustling of mature cypress trees, which some say are not stirred by the wind, but by the movement of unseen crowds across the vast, rolling acreage. Since its inception in 1901, Springvale has served generations, witnessing countless private tragedies. The local legend centers on the original Necropolis train line, which once delivered both coffins and mourners directly to the gates. It is in the vicinity of the former platform, near the older, granite-heavy sections, that the residual emotional weight seems thickest. Staff speaks softly of the trainman's lament, a low, rhythmic moan heard near midnight, attributed to an attendant who died in a siding accident and now wanders the perimeter, searching for the final delivery manifest. The most recurring phenomena documented by security teams and paranormal investigators involve electronic disturbance and visual anomalies within the central vaults. Motion detectors activating crypts confirmed to be completely sealed. Photographs taken after dark frequently capture indistinct, peripheral figures, translucent forms standing at the edge of the light, invariably receding toward the rows of towering memorials. However, the most chilling reports occur near the Brolga section, where witnesses claim to hear a child sobbing, suddenly cut short, followed by the distinct sound of someone dragging a heavy chain across the paved walkway. Yet nothing is ever found disturbed upon investigation. Springvale's sheer size ensures that the haunting is not localized, it is ambient. To stand alone amongst those silent lawns after hours is to be surrounded by thousands of presences demanding recognition. It is a place where the veil between quiet repose and restless despair is thinner than the morning mist, and where the dead walk the manicured paths, eternally waiting for the last train home. That brings our journey through Australia's top 15 haunted cemeteries to a chilling close. We've explored the ghosts of Rookwood, the restless spirits of Karrakatta, and countless other eerie tales buried across the nation. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, hit the like button, subscribe for more terrifying tours, and let us know your favorite ghostly grave site in the comments below. Good night, and happy haunting.